or people gathering, having mass group gatherings and so on, irrespective of any kind of social distancing. We're just going to do what we want. Nobody can tell us what to do. But at any rate, he looks at another one called communitarianism, but that's a little less known. Yeah, but I think it's interesting to set side by side different kinds of ways in looking at it. One of the things I noticed about it is that, I mean, I don't know who's tuning in here, but from an objectivist perspective, I mean, I think that much of this is simply altruism and collectivism. You know, the idea that the moral is somebody's got to sacrifice for someone else, whether it's the minority to the majority, or the majority to the most vulnerable, or everyone to everyone. And that much of the thinking in morality is very collectivistic. In other words, it's not focused on what an individual should do or think or do, or how he should live. But to think about it with the community, should the community do? How should the community deal with the community in terms of groups? But that's basically what we're going to talk about today with Onkar and I.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what's interesting in the article and what it's doing, it's trying to also understand different people's reactions to the pandemic and the various government policies. Not only government policies, but many of the policies, especially government policies that have been enacted to try to deal with it. And it's trying to put it in sort of map the terrain a little bit of why you see some similar but some different responses. And it's part of what if you read the article, and we'll post if you Google how coronavirus is shaking up the moral universe, it'll be the first or second hit that you get. So the article is, I think it's interesting from the point of view of this is how philosophical ideas come to shape people's thinking. So the author's not a philosopher, but I'm guessing has taken either some straight philosophy classes or has been in a professional ethics in engineering, science, law. And these are the alternatives you're typically given. When I was taught theories of justice, there was Rawls. So you have a Rawlsian one, you have the utilitarians, and you have something like the libertarians. Then they bring up Nozick and so on. And it's like, this is the terrain and how to think about these issues. And these people or these theories or viewpoints are debating among themselves. And that is how everyone is taught in one way or another. And it has an impact on how people think about this, people think about the then reactions to the pandemic. And from the objectivist point of view, and from Ayn Rand's point of view, part of what you brought up, Aaron, is like altruism's not obvious. I don't think the word is ever used in the whole essay. And yet, when you think about what is being argued in the essay, you can't really understand so I think he personally leans towards the Rawlsian viewpoint, but also says this seems to be what dominates the response. And I don't think I think it's right to think that this dominates the response, but I don't think you can understand that without getting that what is behind that there's a deeper moral issue behind these different viewpoints, which is altruism. And this is part of the evidence of how saturated people's minds are with altruism.
Yeah, and it comes out in the article because when he talks about the Rawlsian perspective, and he says you can capture it as it's the criterion for social action is what we do with the most vulnerable, like how they're most affected. That should be the primary concern. And he notes that the resonance this has with us there's something deeper to it. There's something more deep that really explains why this resonates with us, and also why certain religious figures that he cites in the piece have also adopted something of a similar kind of language about the most vulnerable among us, the weakest among us, and so on. But what he sees as the deeper issue that really resonates with us and explains why we are drawn more toward the Rawlsian view, he puts it as the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. It depends how you want to put it. And I don't think that's right. I don't think that's what explains the appeal that something like Rawls's perspective would have on us. But the deeper issue is the altruism, and it's also why it's the connection to religion as well. I mean, in our culture, it's Christianity predominantly, the Judeo-Christian view. And that has been much of an issue of it's about sacrifice for some other, it's caring for the poor. And that has really saturated the culture to the extent to which you can look at, you see a Rawlsian perspective and a utilitarian and a communitarian perspective, and they all seem like here's three different frameworks or perspectives for looking at it. But there's a sense in which it's just one framework. I mean, at the fundamental level, that it's all driven by an altruist perspective and a collectivist perspective.
Let's say a little bit more on the, so the I think first we should talk a little bit about the Rawls versus utilitarian and the way he looks at that, and then the bringing in the libertarians as a contrast. So one of the things you brought up, which I think is important, is he links Rawls with religion, which not that many people do, but I think it is right to make that link. That what Rawls emphasizes is what you have to take into account is the most vulnerable, the worst off, and these are different formulations in the piece, putting it in religious terms, that the meek and the poor in spirit shall inherit the earth. Like everything revolves around that. The Rawls is really pushing that. And one quote from the article of linking religion to this is, so quoted from the article, some religious leaders have approached the awful dilemmas presented by the coronavirus just as Rawls would, by taking treatment of the worst off as the criterion for social action, close quote. And if you think of what happened in the US, but I think it's happened in a lot of countries in Europe, in effect, as well, it's that a denial of what is going on with the virus, a downplaying of it, it will miraculously go away. So basically doing nothing, no preparations, no getting tests ready, no getting the hospitals ramped up and so on. And then it was, oh no, but the virus is here and it's actually infecting people and some people are dying, and it's skewing towards the very old and people with some pre-existing conditions. Many of the elderly who were dying had those. When you read about it, they have more than one. It's not just that they're old and have some kind of condition. And when it was infecting and leading to really severe outcomes for sort of middle-aged people, that it was also usually they have some kind of predisposition, existing condition that is making them more susceptible to it. And all the focus became, we have to prevent this. They're vulnerable, and so you went quickly from doing nothing to shutting down states and whole economies, because it was, well, look, there's the vulnerable and so on. They're who we should be paying all attention to. They're dying, and there wasn't really any discussion of, okay, we need to isolate them. We need to cordon off them. Maybe we'll support them in their self-isolation, provide them with food, make it easy to order things through delivery services and so on. It was all the focus of everybody's life now has to be adjusted to the most vulnerable. And that language was used. And I think that's part of why he's picking out that this seems to, in terms of the moral framework, this seems to be guiding us in how we're thinking about this. And I think there's a real truth to that. And then maybe say a few words now, the way he thinks about utilitarianism in this regard, I think is very interesting and sort of what's unpalatable about it.
Yeah, and this, in discussions, and what he finds unpalatable about it is often comes up in philosophy classes anytime you discuss utilitarianism. But so some of his examples of thinking about this from a utilitarian perspective are, well, there are considerations about the most vulnerable. On the other hand, that can't be what drives how we think about social policy and what we're going to do. It's what is the total aggregate of the harm involved, and we have to look at what that is. So when we can look back at some economic models and so on and say, here's what it looks like. Here's what it's going to look like for the next, say, 10 years for the economy. And you look at all the economic hardship, the loss of wealth, loss of capital, businesses closing, and people's lives even shortening in effect as a result of this. You have to take that into consideration. And it may, and some of our policies may result in some of the most vulnerable people dying. But it's the way to look at the aggregate. And I think what he finds, and he quoted there was a, now I don't have the thing, but it was a British minister who apparently allegedly said in a private meeting that, well, if we need to allow people in effect to get sick, to get sort of national, herd immunity or something. If some pensioners die, well, that's what you got to do.
Yeah, and people, if you want the quote, I have it in front of me, and it's so this has been denied that he actually said this.
Yeah, that's why I said allegedly, because I'm not sure.
Yeah, but it was last weekend. Britain's Sunday Times reported that Dominic Cummings, chief advisor to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, had advocated in private meetings a policy of letting enough people get sick to establish nationwide herd immunity. And now quoting from the story, herd immunity, letting enough people get sick, to establish herd immunity, protect the economy. And if that means some pensioners die, too bad. Yeah, I mean, the too bad is pretty.
Yeah, and I think this is and the the author, says about this. I mean, this caused a bit of an outrage, and because it seems so horribly callous. And like if this is the result of the way in which utilitarians think about the issue, there's something really problematic about it. And I think what's problematic about it is that there's no concern for individuals. I mean, I think that's the whole collectivized way of thinking about ethics. So we look at some aggregate, and if it has this bad result for you, so much the worse. And there is a sort of callousness to that, a callousness in regard to that.
Well, but notice also the way he presents it is in the Rawls framework, people get sacrificed. Some people to other people. And in the utilitarian framework, people get sacrificed, some people but the Rawlsian one is much more palatable because it's people who are doing better sacrificed to people who are doing worse. And so the lives destroyed, and it really is, there are lives destroyed of people who own businesses who've gone to zero revenue. I mean, they have they're not taking any money in. I mean, we have a housekeeper who she's lost like half her business. And I actually think not for the best of reasons. It's irrational decisions on some people's part, but it's I mean, how is she going to cope? What is she going to do? There's real damage, but that, for the sake of, as it will be put, for the most vulnerable, that's viewed as much more palatable than the other way around. So the utilitarian is viewed much more as, okay, well, no, there will be a few more deaths among the people the most vulnerable, but other people will do better. And he puts it as explicit utilitarian thinking seems beyond the pale. But it's not this issue of sacrifice to him that seems beyond the pale. It's the issue that you would sacrifice, of who's being sacrificed to whom. That's what's beyond the pale. And the Rawlsian one's palatable because it's as they'll characterize, the vulnerable, the meek, the worst off. And that they have a claim and that other people should sacrifice, that's viewed as, yeah, who could question that? And that's how Ayn Rand views altruism. So in the sense that altruism is in the background, there's an issue about sacrifice, but the Rawlsian framework is viewed as, yeah, this is an acceptable sacrifice because it's from their framework, it's the non-meek, the non-poor spirit being sacrificed to the meek, the poor in spirit, and that's okay.
Yeah, and some of the way the utilitarian view's been put is that if you take economic considerations as as having real weight and real standing in the way we should think about these things, and you put them in the balance, so to speak, with people's lives, that there's already something callous about that. There's always something obviously wrong about that. Yeah, and again, that's all coming from the kind of altruist perspective. Let's see here. And that's why, you know, when I think what's good about the article is that he's putting out these different frameworks and asking us to think about it. But I don't think, I mean, now the author doesn't always choose the title of an article, so sometimes that's done by other people. But it's how the coronavirus is shaking up the moral universe. And my view is it's not shaking up the moral universe at all. In a sense, yeah, okay, so some people might revisit some ideas, but to shake up the moral universe is more what Ayn Rand is doing. To shake up the moral universe, in a sense, is to question the fundamental of these social philosophies, if you want to call it that, and challenge the notion of altruism, and ask not just like, should I follow this social philosophy or this one or this one or this one? It's more like, why do we even need morality? What's it focused on? What are values? Why do we need them? And challenging the fundamental principle of our moral universe, which is altruism. Like it or not, that's what it is. And she challenges that in a very deep and fundamental way. And I think that's the kind of shaking up. I mean, you may agree or disagree with what Rand's perspective is on, but that's what it looks like to really grapple with our moral philosophy and how to think about life.
And he doesn't know what to do with it. So as you said earlier, he brings up Ayn Rand as he puts it under the title of libertarian. So these are people supposedly who are rejecting both Rawls and rejecting the utilitarian framework. And that's certainly true of Ayn Rand. And he brings up, and he ties her and this kind of viewpoint to Locke, the Enlightenment, the American founding fathers, which I think is right as well.
Yeah.
But there's no real appreciation that part of what they were trying to do, I think, and part of the way to think about the issue of rights and to think about the Declaration of Independence and its principles, that you have a right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that governments instituted among men to secure these rights. It's a perspective on government and on political power that it does not exist, that is, it does not properly exist, to sacrifice some to others. And whether it's the kind of Rawlsian kind of view that you'll sacrifice the able to the needy. I mean, the Rawlsian view in the end is very Marxist in morals, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. It's that kind of perspective. And the utilitarian one is that it's sort of the sacrifice any minority to the majority if it would make, on average, supposedly people happier or better off. That it's when you have a right to the pursuit of your own happiness, it's the government is not there to dispense sacrifice, to pick, as it's put colloquially, winners and losers. It's there to protect everybody's rights equally. So there's a fundamental equality, but not in the Rawlsian sense of equality of outcome, but equality of political standing, and that the government's job then is to secure everyone's rights. And the moment it starts thinking about who are we going to sacrifice to whom, it's gone wrong. But he doesn't get that's part of the perspective. And it's the kind of examples he brings up then are examples of people engaging in, well, okay, so what I'm allowed to do is sacrifice others to the pursuit of my own ends or whims. He brings up the spring breaker, but his last, I think it's the last example he has, is kind of a more serious example. He brings up Rand Paul and the story where it was, look, you've been around someone with coronavirus, you need to get tested. And he's supposed to self-isolate. And he doesn't. He's going around and he uses the pool and the gym, I think, as well. And that is that kind of activity, if the scenario painted is right, that he's been told you've been exposed, we've got a test, you're supposed to isolate until the test comes back, and he doesn't do it, that's jeopardizing the rights of other people. So the idea that Ayn Rand would think that this is morally okay, certainly not, but not even politically. Like in a context where we've got a virus going around, we don't quite know what is happening. If there's real reason to think you're contagious, you can't just go walking around infecting other people. That's not within your freedom or within your right. Precisely because rights are supposed to be, there's no sacrifice of one person to another. And it doesn't give you the power to go around threatening people with, you might get if you come by me, you might get a deadly disease. But it like that, he can't get that. Because it's always, well, somebody's got to be sacrificed.
Yeah, and so I mean, when you think about, when you think about from the objectivist perspective, what the moral or social framework ought to be, it's individual rights, but that cuts both ways. It's not just that you have certain freedoms and you can go do things, but also when you think about what you're doing in your actions, you can't violate other people's rights too. And I think that there is a responsibility that's involved to that. If you're committed to the protection of your own rights, you need to be committed to the protection of rights as such, in principle, and that involves certain responsibilities. So we might need to move on to the Q&A.
Yeah, sure. But just if we just say a word in conclusion. So part of what is interesting about this is that I think he's right that these are some of the strands of moral thinking that is going on. But what he's most right about is not something explicitly in the article, which is that everybody thinks about morality as it's about sacrifice. And the question is only who's going to be sacrificed to whom? And is it going to be everybody to the worst off? Is it going to be the minority to the majority? Or is it going to be, in effect, self-centered people who can do whatever they want and trample over the lives, happiness, and rights of other people? And this is unfortunately what you're most often taught, I think, today about morality. It's about figuring out what's the proper form of sacrifice. And this, go ahead.
Yeah, and we're in 2020. I mean, Ayn Rand has been making that exact point since the 50s. This is all about what morality is about.
Yeah, and you can't think properly, but you can't think in the American way. So about American system of government and American ideals, if you think life and morality is about sacrifice. Yeah, okay, so let's turn to questions.
Yeah, let's take a look at some of the things we've got here. So we have a chat, but there's tons of stuff in the chat. I don't know if I'm...
Yeah, and there's one here. This might be good for you. Is it fair to say that the utilitarian view is like the ancient Romans and that Rawls' view is like the Christians? And so I said for Aaron because Aaron did ancient philosophy.
I don't know what you mean by connecting the utilitarian view with the ancient Romans. So I don't know. Do you mean philosophy as it was practiced in ancient Rome? I'm not sure exactly.
It might mean sort of thinking of the Roman Empire as what's important is that it endures. And so you're thinking of as they were willing to sacrifice minorities to majorities to keep sort of cohesion, and I suspect it's something like that.
Yeah, so I'm not sure because I would have to guess at that as well. I think the Rawlsian view. So you're drawing a contrast: utilitarian Roman, Rawlsian Christian, and I don't know if that's the right contrast, but I mean there's certainly there's a reason why Rawls's view resonates with the Christian audience. I mean, partly it's the focus on the vulnerable. We have to protect them, and if it involves shrinking liberties and a welfare state, so be it. That's what we ought to do. And I think that connection is really there.
In the article he brings up, who we didn't talk about because it's not very well known outside of academic circles, the communitarians. But I think some of them put ancient Rome as thinking it's a communitarian ethic. So I'm guessing, in terms of thinking of this author of how he thinks about it, I suspect that's where he would put. So it's a different. Would view it as different than Rawls, and I view it as different as well.
Okay. Let's see here. Oh, so the person who asked that question said, "Yeah, you got it." So that's the perspective he was indeed coming from. Okay, good. Well, that's good to know.
So here's a question. Isn't it ironic that the advocates for sacrifice are not part of the group that would be sacrificed? I mean, this is a point Ayn Rand made, certainly in The Fountainhead, it comes up that where someone's speaking of sacrifice, there's going to be collectors of sacrifice. So it sets up in some kind of way a double standard in morality, because if everybody's sacrificing, who's collecting? And for altruism, her view was the double standard is, it's contained in, this is again to go to the Marxist slogan, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. You don't count if you're able to produce, if you're able to work, to create values, to achieve life. You don't count because you're able. And the person, from that whole perspective, the person who counts is precisely because he's not able to. So the double standard, she put, because he's in need, he's unhealthy, it's various kinds of ways that the need will be cashed out. But as she put it in Atlas Shrugged, you get a double standard where the criteria for the moral elite, so the criteria where you can collect and not have to sacrifice, is that you don't have value. She put it, it's the aristocracy of non-value. It's the unhealthy, the blind, the sick. I mean, if you think again of the religious kind of the lepers,
the uneducated.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, go ahead.
It's your pass key, is what's the phrase that you said? Your pass key to the moral elite is lack of value, and doesn't mean you have no value, like you're worthless or them, but it's the absence of something. It's the absence of education, the absence of money, the absence of healthcare, the absence of it's all of these things that it's a lack. That puts you in the category of that you can now get stuff. You have a moral right to get things from other people. And if you're successful and you're educated and you have money and you have healthcare and stuff, that's what puts you in the category as your obligation is to sacrifice.
Yeah, so as an enduring phenomenon, you see this kind of double standard, but it is true. You find some people who advocate this kind of view and practice it. Like if you think in religion, the so-called moral saints are often what they do is endure incredible hardship, penalize themselves, try to give away all their money, all their wealth, all their time. Some stop talking, drink laundry waters, and it doesn't actually make it good.
No,
that they think they're practicing sacrifice.
Yeah. I'll take another question. This one's coming from, I guess we don't have a name here, just a phone, Galaxy Tab S6. He says, he or she, I find that if I bring up individual rights, many people have a very murky idea of what encompasses a right. It's hard to know where to go next. Yeah, and I can sympathize with that. I have to say, I often feel this way, that, to point out that some policy or some law, it's like, this violates individual rights. It's just half of what's done, it violates individual rights. So it's a kind of hard, it's like in the culture, it's not well understood at all. And a lot of it's muddied by thinking about it's not just a right to freedom of action, that it's a right to things, outcomes. It's a right to healthcare. It's a right to a job. It's a right to things, stuff, and provided by others. And then you're often talking past each other or at cross purposes. You have to establish from the outset that, and this is a whole argument. So it's like they're not going to go, oh, okay, now I get it. But to put it that, what rights designate are freedom of action. And you have to explain why that is. If you want to get into it with somebody or move the dial a bit.
but even if you have a better understanding of rights, so it certainly is true that people throw it out as it's supposedly should end the argument that it violates rights. So yeah, but why is that the crucial thing?
Yeah.
If you have a better understanding, if you understand where the principle comes from, it nevertheless will be the case that it will often put you at odds today with people. And that's for the moral issues, that rights are anti-altruistic.
Yeah.
Or to put it positively, and they're egoistic. So it's a right to the pursuit of your life, a right to produce and keep the property that you've produced. And it's a right to pursue your own happiness. So it rejects the idea that you're the servant of others, or that your life or time in some way belong to them. That it's the pursuit of your happiness, not the pursuit of the welfare of the worst off, as it would be, say, for all. I mean, that's what you're supposed to be doing. It's part of what a proper social contract would be for the Rawlsian perspective. The rights perspective is no. It's you have your life that you're supposed to be trying to live, and that's the same of others. So you can't interfere with other people's lives, but you're not here to serve others. And insofar as that's the moral framework that people think, but no, deep down, that's why you are here, then rights, you're not going to win the argument because you have to address the moral issue of why is altruism right and egoism wrong.
Yeah, and that's the thing that most people won't challenge or don't know how to challenge. And I mean, if you're interested in challenging, look at Ayn Rand. She has the best case for this. But another thing that comes up in this context of rights. So suppose you even won that argument. They say, okay, so the government should only be protecting individual rights. Individual rights are about freedom of action and so on. Suppose you even won that. What the discussion surrounding the pandemic has brought out for me, and it made this really, I mean, I know this, but it's one of these things that really brings it to the fore. The application of rights is very non-obvious. Okay, so let's say where everybody's on the same page that the government should be protecting rights and so on. So what should we do? And that's not cut and dry. It's not obvious. I mean, what a philosophy gives you is principles, but to apply the principles in practice in a way that actually protects and secures rights, and in a certain kind of a context, it's not obvious. It's not textbook. It's not, well, obviously, if you have freedom, you can just go, if I get corona, I get corona. But then does the government have the right to just simply lock down everybody in the economy? And I find that there's a lot of disagreement, whether it's in social media or it's in the press and so on. Even about people who broadly agree with an objectivist perspective, there's a lot of disagreement back and forth about, like, is this legitimate or not? I mean, I've heard people say, some of the lockdowns are legitimate because, you just can't go around spewing disease. And on the other hand, it's like, but I don't have the disease, or I have no reason to think that I do. Why am I locked down? And there are guideposts for this, and there are real principles involved, but I don't think it's textbook how to answer these.
Yeah, no issue about rights is they're not like written on the tablets like the 10 Commandments, and okay, we've got them now. They're principles you're formulating to organize society, and there's a lot to think about in order. I mean, the whole application of rights to a whole legal system and defining that is a complicated endeavor. And this is one aspect of what would be contemplated. But what's relevant for what we're talking about today, I mean, so we've got 45 minutes. We can't cover everything. It's the way that people are thinking about this. And so I would take the point as they're not thinking about it in terms of rights and the American principles. And what does the American form of government, what does it entail? It can't entail anything like what's happening in China or what happened in China. I mean, that's an authoritarian system in which the government has total power. And you're trying to think, okay, so what would it mean if we were taking rights seriously? That's the point. And that the article that we were talking about can't really envision that. And I think it's not unique to this author. It's most people aren't even thinking of it in the right framework. That doesn't yet give you the answer, but it guarantees you won't get to the right answer. That is the American system of government's answer if you're not even thinking properly about, well, what is the American system of government and what is different from all the other. I mean, why did they view it as this is a new form of government, not like the ones in Europe, and certainly not like China in the past or today? And you can't answer that question unless you're thinking of it from the right framework. It doesn't automatically give you the answer, but it's necessary, not sufficient.
Yeah. And the way in which that kind of American framework gets up, he puts it in a libertarian framework. And then when you look at all the examples, it's I do what I want, no matter its impact on other people. And that's not a rights perspective. If you had a rights perspective, you'd start to really grapple. And some of the questions are like, well, but can I go out? Does it matter whether this somebody asked, Kyle asks, does the severity of the consequences of infection matter? Should I be required to self-isolate due to the common cold? So part of it is, well, if I've got a cold and I go to the grocery store and I could possibly get somebody else the cold, is that the perspective in which you would think of, am I violating their rights versus if I give them, COVID-19 and or the plague or
yeah,
SARS?
we'll actually talk about some of that. I think I'm pretty close to positive that we will, or sort of pretty close to certain. This Saturday, we're having we had a conference scheduled for Chicago this Saturday, which obviously, like everything else, has been canceled. And we're doing an online event, I think 1 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. And we're going to talk about some of the issues about the proper role of government, thinking of it from an American perspective of the American system of government. And that will be one kind of thing that will definitely come up, about thinking more broadly about infectious disease, not just COVID-19.
Yeah, and it's worth bringing out that a lot of this discussion that we're having is, we're following the news, we're processing this stuff. Neither of us are epidemiologists, but we're, kind of keeping track of what's going on and trying to offer a perspective from a philosophic perspective rather than a medical one per se. So some of the medical questions that we get asked, some to the extent that they bear on rights, they also bear on what are the actual medical facts, and sometimes those need to be ascertained before even answering the question. So it's not a cut and dry answer, which is important. So let me just pop up a little poll here. We're trying to gauge some of our audience's familiarity with Ayn Rand. So let me launch this poll. It's just one question. What's your familiarity with Ayn Rand's writings and ideas? And so even if you're a regular attendee of our webinars and so on, go ahead and answer so we can get a sense of where you're coming from. And if you think you're finding some value from these webinars, feel free to share the links with others you might think would like it, and we'd appreciate that. Onkar, any last thoughts?
Well, we probably just should. So I mentioned that we have a online sort of webinars conference on Saturday from 1 to 4:30 p.m. And then the next one of these will be Wednesday at what is it, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m.? Yeah,
11 p.m. Not 11 p.m., 11 a.m. Pacific. Yeah, so we're running this series Mondays and Wednesdays, at least for the time being. And so feel free to join.
Yeah, and we've asked in the past about topics for webinars. So here we're doing for the next few weeks, as this is the major issue on everybody's mind. We're focused on this, but there's so many aspects of what is going on with the pandemic and the response to it. So if you have suggestions for aspects that we could talk about, you can send it. What is it, to webinars@aynrand.org?
Yeah, webinars/aynrand.org. Yeah. And then if you'll see upcoming, but you can also click on the tab that says past webinars. So you can click on that. It's a whole list of things that we've done in the past you can watch if you didn't get to see now. And since we're broadcasting this out on a number of different channels, you can see this on YouTube as well. All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me, Onkar.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron.
And thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks.